Thanks, Ariane. Thanks, Pat, for the opportunity to talk to you about about our new spaceport, the newest, obviously, in the country. 11 spaceports now, commercial spaceports in the country. Out of that number, there are 6 of them that are similar to the Colorado Air and Spaceport, specifically in that they are dual-use facilities, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. This is the map, shows you where we are. On the left side of the screen there is where where Denver is, and then Denver International Airport's the big blue spot in the middle, and we're located about 6 miles to the southeast of the big airport there. So that creates some challenges, obviously, and I think some specific challenges within our licensing process. And a little bit on the history of that. I think when you look at Colorado, it has a history as an aerospace state. Right now, it's identified as the number 2 aerospace economy in the country. So that's a big key when we're looking at how does this spaceport then fit into that whole process there. So I think when we look back, 2012 was a little bit of a turning point for the state. Prior to that, there'd been quite a bit of discussion about whether or not Colorado could be a spaceport state and what that would look like. About 2012, the state legislature passed liability insurance to protect space operations. And then the Governor Hickenlooper at that time said, we want this to be a spaceport state. He put out a resolution stating that and identified Front Range Airport as the potential location for that spaceport. Fast forward, started the application process. That was before my time there. I came in 2014, and we kind of had run into a bit of a roadblock with the type of vehicle we were looking at, and it specifically that was the Concept Y vehicle, the X-Core type vehicle. And I think the challenge there is just, and it's true with all of these different vehicles, is there's really not a lot of data on how they're going to act, how they're going to react in the environment when they're coming back in. Challenging for those types of vehicles that are glide back type vehicles. I think when you're looking at bringing it back into an environment like the area there around Denver International Airport. Not that it can't be done and not that it won't be done in the future, but I think that is something that from the licensing perspective and especially from the stakeholder perspective, you need to be able to see some data about how that's actually going to work and what that's going to look like before you bring that into that environment. So we had a great discussion with the Office of Commercial Space. Great partners in the whole process. They put together a meeting with the headquarters staff from the key lines of business within the FAA, in particular the airports division, the air traffic control division, flight safety divisions, and brought those folks in. We sat down and we talked about what could work in the Denver environment, and came up really with the Concept X vehicle as the most likely type of vehicle to look at for this application. Obviously, there isn't one of those vehicles out there right now, but from the perspective of if you're looking at future vehicles, to be able to have something that can operate as an aircraft, at least for the takeoff and recovery portions of the flight, is valuable when you're trying to figure out how that fits into that airspace discussion around the Air and Spaceport. So location is a key, I think, for us. It made the process harder, I think, in a lot of ways, but I think when you're looking at a place that you want to have be a commercial operation, a commercial launch operation in this case, then you want to be close to your customers. I think the challenge for specifically commercial operations is how do you get people in and out? How do you find workforce? How do you bring companies into that area that want to be there, want to locate in that area? And I think that location is something that helps out with that ability to cater to the customers, not only that we already have, but to encourage other customers to come into the area. There are certain things, obviously, that we can't do there because of that location, and I think test and evaluation is probably one of those things. But that's why there are multiple spaceports, and I think there are some, obviously, many spaceports that can do a better job with that. Spaceport America is a great opportunity there. Mojave Air and Spaceport's another one. So we can't all do the same things. That's true of airports. It's certainly true of spaceports going forward. What we do have is we have some room around the Air and Spaceport there and on it. Doesn't quite compare to something like Spaceport America, which has lots more space than we do. But when you're talking about a facility that's close to a major metropolitan area, to have that much space, not only on the airport, but around the Air and Spaceport is unusual. And it's an opportunity for us to be able to try to attract those kinds of companies that need that room for development. The other thing is the geometry of the airport. The history of this particular airport is that it was originally designed to be a cargo airport to relieve Stapleton, which was the original airport there in Colorado, in the Denver area. That didn't end up happening, but it did result in a very wide open architecture for the airport, which means that we have room for infrastructure development going forward. If we need longer runways, if we need wider runways, if we need ramp areas or taxiways, we have the ability to make those kinds of changes. The other thing is that we've got some great business parks that are located right around the Air and Spaceport that have heavy rail access, that have access to the same kinds of things that make the Air and Spaceport valuable, but for companies who either don't need to or don't want to be located directly on the Air and Spaceport, there's a place for them to go where they can still be associated with that high-tech center that will develop around the Air and Spaceport. So the things that are unique, I'm not sure that any of these things are unique in and of themselves, but I think the combination is probably what makes a difference. I talked about the proximity to Denver. Denver's got one of the most highly educated workforces in the country. I think we're number 3 right now. The ability to have access to something like Denver International, a great international airport, great opportunities for people to come and go using that for access to those businesses, access to space tourism, to launch capabilities. That multimodal access is another thing. The ability to have heavy rail that can bring in large parts and pieces for final assembly, whether it's for aircraft or spacecraft, is something that we've already seen a benefit to with other companies that are looking at locating there. And then the favorable zoning thing, I think, is really important. When you look at airports in general, one of our big challenges is how do we deal with residential encroachment or business encroachment that isn't compatible with the operations that are going on the airport. And this is doubly true with the spaceport addition there. Big concern about when you go through the licensing process for the spaceport. One of the things you're looking at is what is the risk model there? What is that risk impact from having that kind of operation on the spaceport there? Well, that is impacted then by what is around the spaceport. So if you have residential encroachment that occurs after you have your spaceport, well, then you could make it very easily or very quickly something where you couldn't have the license there any longer. You no longer qualify because of that risk mitigation issue. So having zoning that prevents that kind of encroachment on the airport is valuable, and that also helps out the airport and helps to maintain that capability. Foreign trade zones, enterprise zones, airport acceleration zones, all those things that can help businesses that come into the area. I think those are valuable things, and we do have some of those at the Air and Spaceport here, and I think that's true around many of the spaceports. And then we have room to grow. And again, I think it depends on where you're at, but when you're at an airport that's close to a metropolitan area, having just room to grow on and around it is something that is fairly rare. So we have a suborbital spaceflight license specifically for horizontal launch. Space planes that operate similarly to aircraft. This is for scientific research purposes to support the scientific research, education, space tourism, point-to-point high-speed travel, hopefully in the future, to support those companies that are located in the Denver area or the new companies that will come in. And it's specifically focused on that Concept X vehicle, as I mentioned. I don't think there's any question that we could operate any of those types of vehicles there in the future, but I think it will take time to be able to develop that data set so that we know what that looks like. So dual-use facilities. This is something I mentioned. There are six of the commercial spaceports right now that are dual-use facilities. I think this is an important part. I think this is a benefit not only to the communities, but it's also reduces the costs then that come up in relation to future operations. So infrastructure, we already have the runways, the taxiways, the ramp areas, the hangars that are needed for space operations. They're also needed for airport operations, so those things are maintained. That reduces those startup costs. We also have protections in place then that are just natural to an airport, that your approaches and departures are protected. You have airport influence zones around the airport that protect you from some of that encroachment, and many things like that that ensure that you've got compatible businesses on and around the air and spaceport going forward. So those are valuable, and that helps with sustainability, as I mentioned. The other thing that helps with sustainability is that we already have an active general aviation population on the airport, a lot of aviation businesses that are there that will remain there and will continue to help paying the bills as we're waiting for space industry to come in and interested launch providers and those kinds of things. Some of the challenges, I think you heard some of that yesterday from Eric Stallmer. He talked about the airspace challenges. I think that's a very real concern, and I think partly because of our licensing process that a lot of attention was brought to the airspace question. But I think that's something that as an industry we have to be aware of, is that when you look at airlines and some of the other interested parties, industry groups that are associated with the aviation side, their goal, at least initially, has been to limit access to the national airspace system, and that's obviously not something we want to have happen with commercial space. So I think being constructively involved in that discussion, making sure that we're part of that discussion, is going to be very important, and that's the kind of thing that I think Eric was talking about with CSF. The other thing is there are some specific things about airports that can be a challenge from the point of view of operating a space operation on the airport. And that specifically is that airports specifically designate property as aeronautical or non-aeronautical. If you've got aeronautical property, which is most of what's on the airport, you can't do things that don't involve an airplane on that area. Commercial space has been identified by the FAA as a non-aeronautical function, so that creates an automatic challenge then to be able to do those space functions then on an existing airport. This is something that the FAA is aware of. They're working through that, how they change that definition or how they adjust those regulations, but it is something that we have to be aware of, that the definitions that apply for aviation don't necessarily apply to commercial space, and there can be regulations that actually preclude some of the space operations. The airspace thing I think is a good part of the discussion here. This specifically shows our notional special use airspace. This isn't necessarily what will actually be used by the vehicle, but we had to be able to show that we could demonstrate one area where our proposed vehicle could operate without having a significant impact on the other national airspace users in the area. We went to air traffic control. They identified this. They looked all around the air and spaceport there. They identified this as one possible site. And they basically looked at it and said this is not going to have a significant impact either on the international airport or on the en-route traffic that comes through the areas. So I think the ability to demonstrate that, to show that this can be done without having a significant impact, helps to calm that airspace discussion significantly. You've seen these kinds of diagrams before. Basically the space plane takes off from the air and spaceport, flies out to the east, actually to the eastern edge of that special use airspace I just showed you, turns back around, obtains clearance from the FAA to engage its rocket engine. The rocket engine burns for about 2 minutes in this model. That takes it up to about 150,000 feet. It glides from there on up to apogee at about 350,000 feet. and then descends back into the atmosphere. As it slows down and descends back down into the aircraft operating altitudes, down at about 50,000 feet, it re-engages the jet engines and then follows conventional flight rules back into the Air and Spaceport. So what is the purpose of doing this? What do we hope to gain from it? And this list of possible uses is probably the same for any spaceport that you're going to go to. So I think space tourism has been brought up as one possible use for the technology. Space pilot training is another thing. This is something that's a challenge right now in the United States because military aircraft are normally used for that kind of high-G training, and those are considered experimental aircraft, and therefore you can't use them for for-hire training. There is legislation in Congress right now to change that so that those types of aircraft could be used for that kind of training, but it would only be allowed on spaceports, so that automatically makes that a good fit for any of the spaceports. Payload delivery, we've had a lot of discussion about that. It's something that we certainly hope to have the opportunity to do. Research experiments that you can then bring right back to where your research institutions are. And of course, manufacturing of all things associated with commercial space as well. And then I think in the long term, the point-to-point idea is something that's interesting, and I think it helps to have some context on that. I recently looked at the website for the flight out of Denver that goes to Tokyo. It's a direct flight. It cost you about $10,000 for a business class seat on that flight. It's about a 13-hour flight, so if you've got a 1-hour meeting in Tokyo, you're going to have about 3 days of travel there. Right now there's a company called Boom Aerospace that's located in Colorado also. They're developing a supersonic aircraft. It's supposed to carry about 30 to 40 people. They've already sold 70 of those airframes, and they haven't even flown their prototype yet. So there's definitely interest out there in high-speed travel and its value to business. I think what's really interesting is then when you look at the space plane part of it, the ability to come into the Colorado Air and Spaceport, climb on your space plane, and take your hour-and-a-half trip to Tokyo, have your meeting, and be home in time for dinner. That's got some value to it then if you're talking about now easily a one-day operation and you're back within your normal workday. There is interest out there. It's finding the right price point. It's finding the right opportunity to do that, I think, in the future. In the short term, the things we're focusing on, I think, true again for all the spaceports, is how do we develop a self-sustaining kind of a business environment on and around the Air and Spaceport. And I think these space sectors that have been developed by the Space Angel Network is a really interesting opportunity for us. Our focus is on trying to find companies within each one of those sectors then and attract those companies to operate on and around the Air and Spaceport so that we develop that kind of a self-sustaining high-tech business park that will provide what's needed for those companies as well as supporting those operations there on the Air and Spaceport. The last thing I have is a video that we put together. Just gives you a little bit of an overview of what we're hoping to be able to do with the Air and Spaceport.
For more than a century, the pursuit of flight and space exploration has provided humankind with monumental moments, remarkable milestones, and the continuing quest for what's next. Located just outside Denver, Colorado Air and Spaceport is poised to achieve new heights of prosperity for the commercial space industry. The potential for partnerships includes more than 400 companies already operating in Colorado. These industry leaders are pioneering and supporting groundbreaking missions and research related to space and planetary science. That's right, the state known for mountains and world-class recreation is also home to 21st century jobs and 21st century dreams. The pipeline for aerospace talent also begins in Colorado with graduates from top universities, the United States Air Force Academy, and regional Air Force bases. In fact, there are more than 50,000 aerospace employees in Colorado already working to accelerate the pace of innovation. Our future will certainly include spaceports operating in concert with more traditional transportation infrastructure in our largest cities, and Colorado Air and Spaceport will take the lead. The location in Adams County is only 6 miles from Denver International Airport and even closer to existing rail lines and interstates. With more than 1,000 acres of open land ready for development, licensed operators can help shape the future of this property and its potential. It's a future that will include horizontal launches of vehicles destined for suborbital space. The possible payloads include microgravity experiments or testing and validating components built by Colorado companies for use in commercial and national security satellites. And who can imagine a day when you can board a space vehicle at Colorado Air and Spaceport destined for Europe, Asia, Africa, or South America on a flight that's a little shorter than a feature movie? This is the time for big dreams, the time to pursue what's next, and this is the place. Colorado Air and Spaceport, where the first mile is free.
That's all I've got. Questions?
Thank you, Dave.
Thank you.
All right, we've got some time for Q&A, so please send your questions in. So congratulations on your license.
Thanks.
That's very, very exciting. What does your day-to-day look like now that you've gotten over that tremendous hurdle? Obviously, we've seen a couple of rocket planes in your video. They're, not flying tomorrow,
Hoping
not
for
quite
it.
yet, still in development. Is it now that you're proactively trying to get some of these companies to open up offices? Walk us through your day.
Sure. I think the big focus for us now is changing the branding, kind of moving in this new direction as far as who we are, and making sure that is out there. In the short term, I really think the marketing piece of reaching out to those companies within those space sectors is critical for us, and there's a lot of opportunity for that around the Denver area there. So we're really trying to reach out to those. That doesn't mean that we'll lose track of trying to find companies that will be developing the technology for launch there. We're certainly looking for those opportunities as well. But I think the short term is focusing on the business development piece.
Off the top of your head, when do you think the first organization will be operating out of your spaceport?
As far as a launch provider?
Yes.
So launch providers, I guess I'm an optimist, so I know it takes a long time to license those kind of vehicles, and right now there is not a company with an operating prototype yet. So I would guess it's probably 8 to 10 years down the road, but I think that's a reasonable time frame, especially once we see Virgin Galactic begin operating and there's a proof to the business case for that kind of operation and that kind of a commercial business. I think that will help with some of these other companies that are thinking about the Concept X type vehicle.
To what extent are you working with the other 10 spaceports in the U.S.? There are some people, I'll be honest, there's some people that are questioning the need for 11 spaceport. Yeah, how have you been working together, and maybe how have you exchanged lessons learned?
We do actually meet on an annual basis as spaceports and talk about best practices. We talk about what are some of the things that we might need advocacy for, that we might need to have involvement in as that is concerned. I think there's a couple of things. One of the concerns that I've heard from government is that there's a need for a wide variety of sites for this kind of operation in case something happens to one. If there's a hurricane that wipes out one, is there another opportunity? And Spaceport in Colorado may be able to help with that. Is there enough business out there to support us for commercial space? There could be, and I think we do offer a unique type of environment for that because of our location there in Colorado and with the amount of aerospace that goes on there. I think the good thing about a dual-use facility, again, is that we don't have to just depend on that. So if it takes longer than we're expecting, that's okay. We'll continue to operate as a successful airport. We'll continue to do that. We'll work hard at attracting businesses into that area to help that kind of environment grow. And the reality is that it's not just space companies that are interested in locating and operating off of a spaceport. There are certainly aviation companies that find that environment to be innovative and exciting, and they want to be a part of it. And we've actually had that happen already.
Yeah, absolutely. The Centennial Airport is surrounded by aerospace companies.
Right.
So, curious, we were talking about the other spaceports in the U.S., spaceports internationally. I know DLR, for example, the German Aerospace Center is working on studying precisely some of the challenges that you're having with airspace. Are you really just focusing your efforts domestically? Are you looking for international partners? What does that look like to you?
No, we're certainly trying to include all of those partners. We have a number of the spaceports overseas that come to our spaceport meeting that we have in association with Spacecom down in Houston. So that's been very good attendance from those organizations. And I think again the opportunity to reach out to share best practices, to look at what is helping them, what is working for them, and vice versa, is very valuable to us.
Excellent. What have your neighbor is obviously DIA. What does your regular interaction look like in terms of talking through some of the future aerospace challenges? You are right next door. It's a blessing and a curse, right?
It is. You know, the biggest concern, I think, from Denver International's perspective, and it's always dangerous to talk for somebody else like that, but what they've expressed to us is the predictability question. You know, I think when they look at space operations and they think about, well, how many times does it result in something getting canceled where you've blocked out airspace for a long period of time and you have that kind of an impact. And I think part of that is an education piece to make sure that they understand that horizontal operations are different than vertical operations, and that one of the things we don't have to do is block out large areas of airspace around the airport, the air and spaceport. We do have to close down some airspace, special use airspace, but that has a limited impact, and there's a lot of that impact that we can control by what time of day do we operate, and I think also there's some great technology that the FAA is working on to be able to open and close that kind of airspace progressively so that it has less of an impact. So we've had a lot of discussions about what does that look like and how can we improve that predictability for them and for the airlines so that this isn't something that makes them concerned about whether they're going to be able to meet their requirements as an aviation business.
Great. So jumping from the longer term back to the nearer term, can you tell us, going back to this idea of where your focus is on a daily basis in terms of trying to get organizations to base themselves at your spaceport, are you offering incentives? I mean, I see a lot of Colorado companies in the audience here and from around the country, of course, but it's an expensive endeavor moving your big, heavy infrastructure and equipment over there. What are you? Sell us. You got an audience.
Well, so there are a number of things, and again, it depends on the specifics of the situation, obviously. But one of the keys for the state of Colorado is they're, of course, looking for companies that are bringing jobs. So if there's a company that is coming in and can identify that over a period of time they're going to bring in a certain number of jobs, then there are tax incentives that the state offers. The county then and some of the local municipalities that are associated or right next to the air and spaceport also have incentives that they can offer. Many of those are also tax-related incentives where there can be a period of time where you don't pay any property tax or something like that, and that can extend 10, 20 years, so for quite a long period of time there that has some value. In addition to that, the county in particular does have the ability to offer some financial incentives, and again, that really depends on what kind of business is coming in and what does that look like for the county itself. On top of those kinds of things, from a development perspective, there are some things that we can do as the Air and Spaceport in helping companies that are trying to build infrastructure, whether that is that they don't get charged right away for the lease rates. On an airport in particular, you have to lease property. We don't sell it. But we can make it so that those costs are spread out over a period of time or reduced or delayed until you're actually operational so that you're not having to front load those kinds of costs. And the infrastructure costs are another thing, tap fees and development fees like that we can just internally stretch out over a period of time and not have those be upfront costs that are harder to overcome by a company.
Wonderful. Thanks, Dave. Hopefully you got some prospective customers out there. You can
Thanks.
meet them at our coffee break.
Thank you very
Dave,
much.
thanks so much for your
Appreciate it.
time. A round of
Thank you.
applause for Dave.